welcome to List Off. I'm Ozzy.
And I'm Nat.
And this week, what are we going to be doing, Nat?
We're going to be counting down our top 5 puppets.
Been a big fan of puppets since I was a kid, little kid. I think the first puppets I was into were probably Button Moon, the TV show Button
Yeah.
Moon. And I remember my parents took me to the Button Moon live show, you know, when they do like a TV spin-off live show. But because that was a puppet
show, how did they achieve it?
It was a long time ago. I was very small. But I assume they were bigger than the puppets were on the stage because it was at the Lyric in Hammersmith, so it was a big theatre. And I still remember going to the Lyric Theatre. Like I could still remember that. It was probably the only time I went to West London.
I love Button Moon. I found the idea that the moon is a button, and you knew that he had a wooden spoon for an arm. So it was always like, I mean, the sizes of it bothered me as a kid.
Yeah, the scales are all off. Like the
scales are off.
The wooden spoon fits inside a tin of beans as a rocket.
Yeah,
that's just
exactly
wouldn't work. But that they don't make my list. But that was definitely the earliest for me.
Yeah. I'm a big puppet fan. I think I'll sometimes go with some friends, not on my own for obvious reasons, to the Little Angel Theatre in Angel,
the Angel,
and see their puppets. I like in the Angel. I do like sort of the modern kind of contemporary puppet things and puppet shows. And what's great about those shows is they're made for children essentially, so usually about 40 minutes, which is exactly the right time before you would probably start getting a bit frustrated watching puppets. But it's almost the perfect kind of length of time for a puppet show. They do a really good job there, actually. It's a great little theatre.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I love that place, and it's just the same as it was when I was a kid. Like I went for the first time again with my kids a few years ago, and the room smells the same as it did when I was a kid. You know, your smell memory is so powerful, and it smells exactly the same. It's pretty amazing to have a puppet theatre, you know, in the city.
Exactly.
It's been there all this time.
I'd recommend it to people, and you can go, and it's not, not just for kids. Yeah. Often when you're not with kids, they sort of sit you at the back, which is fair enough. Yeah. You're taller than other kids, and no,
it's a great,
not their seats for adults.
It's a great place. It's a fantastic place. Did you find it hard making the list?
I suspect my problem with this one will be that I will come up with more later on. That's what I feel like. Button Moon crossed my mind, and I like it, but it didn't really make the list.
There's no,
and again, it is a difficult one to do because again, you're sort of creating your own criteria for what the list is and what you want on the list and what you want represented. And to do it, it's almost, I'm kind of, some of them I'm probably fit in a kind of square into a circle of what they represent and things, and some of the puppets represent more than the sum of their own parts, I'd say, in some of my choices.
Do you want to kick us off at number 5?
Sure. My number 5 is Mr. Punch. And I don't like him as a person. I don't think I'd like him if I met him. He's a bad puppet, but I think the Punch and Judy stuff is so endlessly fascinating. And not just the Punch and Judy. I'm sort of obsessed with the kind of the production of Punch and Judy. I find really fascinating, and this idea that it's this old kind of street performance that's from Italy, I believe, originally. It's sort of very old, that's been brought over to the UK and now seems very intrinsically almost seaside British, but is sort of very odd and unsettling, and is essentially about a man who beats up his wife with a stick, and it's high comedy. And I like all the the butchers, the dog,
The sausages.
Judy, the sausages. I like that that whole the sort of display and the idea that you're watching a kind of piece of theatre inside a box, and I like all that, how sort of theatrical it is. It sort of fascinates me enough that I'm kind of, it's one of those things I keep thinking about projects involving Punch and Judy people, and I find the idea as well that it's a thing which is like a folk tradition and almost like an oral tradition where everyone's telling the same story, but they're different puppeteers. And that's sort of why it's sort of so low on my list, is because it's that thing where a lot of things with puppets is that you're talking about the puppet and also the performance of the puppet or the puppeteer. And it isn't that. So the puppet itself represents something, but it's like a sort of folk tradition. It's more like a sort of song or something that it's interpreted by lots of different people in this character. And I find that fascinating. I also find it weird that puppeteering, especially with Mr. Punch, is that you're a performer, and with all puppetry, but you're not on display. I find that really interesting. And as someone who does some performing themselves, I find that interesting, that it's a sort of egoless performance,
Yeah,
and it doesn't involve you
you could have the biggest
so much, but it does.
You could have the biggest puppet, Punch and Judy show in the country in 1850, and still people wouldn't see your face. You'd be, only if they stayed around till you were packing up your barrow to wheel away or whatever,
and just be completely anonymous. And I think it does. It fits in, something like that associate Punch and Judy, like Box of Delights, which involves a Punch and Judy man. The Tony Hancock film, The Punch and Judy Man. Everything about it, I do find it's so kind of ingrained in me from a kid, and how odd it is. I made Punch and Judy puppets in primary school off my own back. It was when I'd often be left alone to my own device in primary school. I was kind of, the teachers seemed to think that I knew most of the stuff already. So if you kind of knew, you could sort of display that you could do your times tables or whatever. It was like, while they're teaching the other kids, what do you want to do? And I'd often go, can I make a pop-up book? I'll learn how to make a pop-up book. And I'd go through pop-up books and learn the mechanics of that. So I'd do that while other kids were doing more boring stuff. And I remember once I decided I wanted to make Punch and Judy men, so I made papier-mâché Punch and Judy heads and things. So from a little kid, it's always been something that has been an interest to me. And that, I think the reason it's not higher on my list is just that, really, that I find a lot of the things with puppets that I like is often that it's the puppeteer and the puppet, whereas Mr. Punch is more like, now it's just it's a bit of iconography, isn't it, that sort of represents something rather than it being the performance itself.
Yeah, it's like Hamlet. You know what I mean? It's like it's a classic role, but you don't know the actor most of the time, and you don't. Yeah,
it's an absolute classic puppet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. My number 5 is also a very famous puppet. It's Kermit T Frog from The Muppet Show and from Sesame Street. I've got to have Kermit because he's just the most expressive, I think, of all these puppets, or one of the most expressive, because of his spindly arms, where he's like, wiggles them all around on the end of his poles, and his kind of very maneuverable neck and in mouth, his kind of beak, whatever, he can do so much. And Jim Henson was such a master puppeteer that he could convey such a crazy range of emotion and reactions with him. I mean, this is a character that's like very calm and collected, and then completely freaks out, and he can do the full spectrum. And he spends so much time being like, oh yeah, that's cool, okay, that's good, all right, okay. And then having these like screaming freakouts on the opposite end of the spectrum, and marry that all up into a character that really works. It's just incredible. He started in 1955 on the Sam and Friends.
I've seen some very early. I presume I don't know if it's even before he's called Kermit, but there are some adverts that were made with Jim Henson obviously voicing a frog character who looks like a prototype Kermit. I don't know when they date from, but they're certainly pre Muppets.
Yeah, he has him on the Sam and Friends 5-minute puppet show that aired twice daily on WRC TV. And the quote from him is that they made the first Kermit from one of his mother's old coats with real ping pong balls for his eyes, and that was it. You know, like a real like homemade thing, and that goes on to be maybe the most famous puppet in the world. You know, it's just incredible. And yeah, you know, Jim Henson voiced and puppeteered him until his death, and in the early '90s, and then the guy Steve Whitmire took over and everything, and I think he's still doing it. And yeah, just an incredible character that you know, so many of us got so much love for. And yeah, he you know, 5's quite a low placing for him in a way, but he's just the most incredible character.
I always like the way, which I think Kermit the Frog and I guess the other Muppets kind of taught kids how to puppet. And I think the best thing about their thing is when they're silent, they kind of move,
Yeah,
and it's the sort of bobbing up and down, or the slightly, you know, there's no power in a still puppet.
yeah,
A still puppet looks dead, where it's always that thing about the sort of bobbing or something almost used to signify breathing or something that sort of really gave life to puppets. And I think it's almost growing up in an era that is post Muppets. I don't know who did it before, but it feels like you would sometimes get on kids' TV puppeteers that would do that. They just weren't as skilled, and they would often just be completely still.
yeah.
And I'd find it, you would actually find it quite disturbing, because it would feel like there's the puppet night or something. Yeah, there's something quite, and there's so much life in that they just obviously noticed. It's that way that I think Jim Henson filmed them, where the puppeteers are, you know, they have a little TV, I think, at their underneath, so so it makes sense that they can do it. Whereas there's this often, I think, you know, the likes of your Gordon the Gophers or Ed the Ducks, that were perfectly good puppets, or probably lesser ones that are probably done by low-paid production staff of the BBC, or reading out birthdays or something. They're probably done by runners that have no skills, and often they have this really odd life to them. They don't particularly work as puppets.
Yeah, they're literally just under a desk. They can't see the monitor, and they can't tell where they should be or anything like that. They're just doing a thing blind. No, I'm sure that's true. But for me, as I'm more of a Sesame Street fan than a Muppet Show fan. So for me, like, you know, my favorite Kermit in a lot of ways is, well, he's great in the films, but I love him in Sesame Street, being reporting for Sesame Street News, but mostly being in his house on Sesame Street, in his apartment, and Grover coming to the door to try and sell him things that he doesn't need. That I just love that. Like, I love him as like the kind of sort of patient but increasingly grumpy, exasperated frog, you know, turning away Grover and squashing his nose in the door. Love it. Absolutely love Kermit.
My number 4 is Basil Brush. And it isn't a puppet I would necessarily have always said, oh, I love Basil Brush. Certainly a constant presence of my youth. But I think I appreciate Basil Brush the older I get. And I think it's because it's such a well-defined character, and such a well-defined kind of comic character as well, that you know exactly what Basil Brush thinks, and essentially what he is. He's not just a sort of puppet fox. He is almost like an upper class puppet fox. He's almost certainly modelled on someone like Terry Thomas,
Right.
and plays that same sort of part. And as a kid, I liked Basil Brush, but he was then off air for an awful lot of it, and I didn't think an awful lot about him. And then when they sort of bring back his series later, and he then gets a new kind of puppeteer, but he's someone who's trying to ape or trying to recreate the sort of 70s, 80s era Basil Brush.
Yeah.
He those shows were so kind of wild, and I'd watch them and go, this is good stuff. And a couple of years ago he was on he did a show at the Edinburgh Festival, and it was one of those things where I had to see it. I just found it, like, the idea of being in the same room as Basil Brush I found really exciting. And as much as anything else, it's just that thing where out of nowhere I didn't really realize how much I liked it. And one of the things I think about Basil Brush is how great Basil Brush would be to write for, in the way that you would write for, like a sort of TV personality or something. It is his persona is so well defined for someone who isn't real that it would kind of be easy and like a pleasure to write for. And in a way, it's not like, there's a lot about Basil Brush now that doesn't really work as a character, and it is kind of old fashioned, and to the point where it's a bit, it can be a bit cringy, but it's more that it's a character that's created and still has this real strong persona that feels like as strong as something like a Basil Fawlty or any of the sort of great kind of sort of character actors that play the same person. It's that sort of, he is Terry Thomas or something. It is that, he's incredibly well defined. And it was just that there was a genuine excitement of like that Edinburgh. And it's also like a sort of silly thing to buy tickets for in Edinburgh, because it's one of those things which is almost like tourist trap thing that's just designed to sell tickets, a bit of a stunt. But yet when I was going and I had a few days in Edinburgh, that's the first thing I booked. It's like, I want to see what this Basil Brush show is like. Because you also want to go, how is Basil Brush doing an hour in Edinburgh?
And I assume with Basil Brush has been through quite a few performers.
Yeah, I think only a couple though. I think you've got one guy who did it in the 70s, and I think there's the guy who has him now, who is now like the Basil Brush puppeteer.
That's quite amazing considering, it's probably 50 years. When you saw him live, was the puppeteer visible, or was he under a desk?
Under a desk,
wow.
I assume.
How long was the show?
An hour.
Ouch.
An hour.
Ouch. I couldn't
do
that.
You got to think of people's knees.
I couldn't do that. I couldn't stay under a desk for an hour. Maybe like a nuclear bomb like problem, I could stay under a desk for an hour. But other than that,
I mean, that's the thing about all puppeteers or all puppeting. It's that kind of, you don't really ever think of a person. It's always just
not if they're doing it right.
Yeah.
My number 4 is a cheat because it's 2 characters. It's another Jim Henson one. It's a theme coming. Even more than that, it's a Frank Oz one. It's Bert and Ernie from Sesame Street. And I think for me, like Jim Henson and Frank Oz are like the 2 titans of puppetry in my life and decade before too. And that's their greatest double act for me. Better than Kermit and Fozzie Bear for me is Ernie and Bert. And just as 2 men living together in New York in their basement apartment at 123 Sesame Street, they're 2 very different guys. They're set up as a contrast, but they have this lovely relationship of the very nice, eager to please, like soft spoken, Ernie, be like, oh hey Bert, what are you doing? And it's the most Jim Henson sort of soft and agreeable and chilled kind of eager to please character. And then you've got the very Frank Oz character of Bert, who is kind of grumpy and what are you doing? That kind of like the real kind of, that's to me, like when I went to New York for the first time when I was 19 or something, that's what it felt like. I was like, going to New York. That's where Bert lives. Everyone in New York is like Bert, you know, like everyone, and they kind of are. They're all like, "Hey, what are you doing?" You know, this guy, like
Yeah.
that's Bert. They all have big eyebrows, and they're like, "Wow, I'm walking here." That's like Ernie is more like a San Francisco guy. I didn't meet anyone in New York like Ernie, but Bert is just New York, and
It's everywhere. One of the great strengths of Sesame Street is that it's set in a real place, and it's a place that is definable, um, and everyone's aware of that place from movies and things, even though it's probably for something which is such a cartoonish version of it, always feels very real and believably New York.
it's Brooklyn, you know, it's specifically Brooklyn, and it's like, and it's all residential. It's not like New York, the Big Apple. Here's the Empire State Building, you know, like we're going to Coney Island, and it's just no, it's just like a residential street in Brooklyn, and with real looking sidewalks, you know, like it's just a set, but it looks solid enough, and it gives you this distillation of kind of New York, and I just love it so much. And Bert and Ernie, I was gonna have one or the other, and I couldn't. No, neither one of them was good enough to get on the list on their own, but together they're just magic. And they got some of the best songs. They made one of my favorite Christmas songs, which will probably turn up in a Christmas list at some point. You know, I got records of theirs behind me sitting there. You know, it's amazing that they could do all that singing in voice as well, in character. You know, like I can't believe that. You know, if you try and do Bert for long, right, your voice hurt, right? To sing with that, you know, imagine doing like 10 takes of a song in voice as Bert. That's just incredible.
Yeah.
They're just, and you know, there's the whole like, you know, are they a gay couple sort of thing? It's like if you think they are, then they totally are. I think that's the answer to that. But they absolutely are two men living together and being very nice to each other, and you know, taking their own prized possessions to the pawn shop in order to buy a Christmas present for the other one.
I think that's where double acts, you know, work really well. That was that thing with Morecambe and Wise, wasn't it? That they were living together, so they'd almost make a virtue of it and have them share a double bed and things, because it's like that we're that's what we are. We're like they're sort of the same person, but in two different, split in two.
Yeah, it's otherwise it's a hassle. You have to be like, oh, one of them's going round to the other one's house, and then we have a sketch. It's no, they live together. That's cool. It works. You know, yeah, absolutely love them. So, yeah, more of the same.
No, great choice. That's an excellent choice. My number 3, I guess, is also a cheat in a way. It's Sweep, the dog from Sooty and Sweep, and I do it to kind of represent Sooty and Sweep and the Sooty gang, including Sue, of course. I think Sooty and Sweep, again, much like Basil Brush, I think are so almost like misunderstood as this kind of, they're absolutely for children. I don't think I appreciated how funny the Sooty Show was until I was about 13 or 14. And I remember sort of catching it once, maybe on a day off or a school holiday or something. And it was one of the earlier children's ITV shows. So this would be when I was 13 or 14, sort of too old for Sooty. And I'd caught one and I really found it funny. And so then I remember I'd actually try and get home quickly so I'd be in time
that's hard
to watch the Sooty Show.
That was quite early. That was a get home.
Yeah, that was an earlier one. I could do it. I think maybe it started at 4. So I think I could do it. I could get there. And I think it's often, these were in the sort of Matthew Corbett years. I think he was Harry Corbett first, I think did Sooty initially, and I think Matthew Corbett's a son.
Yeah.
But they were such funny shows. And again, Sweep is a noisy, squeaky dog. Sooty, of course, the thing is that he talks much quieter. He does talk, but he only really talks in whispers. And the most talkative member of the crew is Sue, the panda bear.
She's like the translator.
Something. Yeah, which is always one of those things I liked as a kid, that she's Sue SOO, and it's like, oh right, yeah, because she's from China, she's a panda bear, and it was the
Didn't realize it. Good one.
yeah. Whereas you think, it was always a little neat. Oh, I get it. She's a panda. He's a dog. He's a bear. There we go. We've got a little Sue. But yeah, no, I just think it's a great show. And again, it's something that I could kind of say that later because of how funny I found it at a time when I should be shrugging it off and being like, what an awful show, or being a bit too cool for school. I think it was a really genuinely funny show, and much funnier than shows that were more obviously comic based.
We do a lot of agreeing with each other on this, right? I'm going to disagree with you here. I really never liked Sooty and Sweep. Never liked any of that. I agree, Sweep's the best one, but I never liked it. I didn't like it as a kid, and I haven't found later that I thought it was really good. Maybe I need to reappraise it, but I just it didn't. It was like, oh, when's the good TV gonna come on? That it never was something I was into. Never.
I think it was. I think it was something I grew out of, and then grew back into. And I remember being like, "Oh, this is really funny. This is really well done."
That's what I did with Sesame Street. Like, I liked Sesame Street as a little kid, and then I was like, it's boring. I don't want. I remember my cousin, who's 4 years younger than me, would watch it, and I'd be like, I don't want to watch Sesame Street. It's so rubbish. And then by the time I was like 11 or 12, I was like, Sesame Street is amazing. I love the music. I love the the characters. I love the jokes. I just loved it. So you can do that. You can, like, in that sort of, like, I don't know, 5 to 10 bit where you're trying to be like, no, I'm not into that anymore. That's for babies, and lose all these things, and then hopefully you can get some of them back. But
yeah,
Sooty, not for me.
There's something quite funny about a man who is obviously spraying himself with a water pistol whilst having a go at himself for spraying himself with a water pistol. There's something about that sort of, and it is that thing where so much sort of puppetry and certainly like ventriloquism and a lot of that stuff that's done now is done in a sort of slightly ironic kind of postmodern way, whereas that's something which is doing it as well, but it doesn't make a big deal of it. It doesn't really wink to the camera. It's almost that what's funny is that you're doing this, and yet you're having a row with someone telling them, whatever you do, don't do this thing, whilst part of your body is literally
It's definitely
disobeying you.
classic comedy, classic slapstick. But no, show didn't work for me. I wasn't a fan. I like that you've got these kind of classic British things in there, though, because I really haven't, as much as I had all them growing up.
So what's your number 3?
My number 3, and you may be seeing a pattern emerging here. My number 3 is a puppet from Frank Oz on Sesame Street, and it is your old buddy Grover. And Grover was probably my number 1 puppet for most of the years of my life, but I've got to rank him as a 3 now. But because he's funny, but he's more just like lovely. He's just a great guy. He's trying to be nice to everybody. You can watch the clip, where he's talking to the little kid, and the kid says, "I love you," and it, interrupts it, and he has to react to that, and he's genuinely touched. But Frank Oz manages to react in character, and just. He's like the best intentions. He's always trying to do things, but he's very bad at doing things. He makes a total mess of them, but he's never being malicious. You know what I mean? So he's incredibly frustrating to Kermit or to the guy who's ordering food. They're like, I want some fast food, and he's like, nope, it's coming up, and then it shoots off into the distance at fast speed. He's never being mean, but he's just kind of incompetent, but lovely.
I think some of those interactions that they have with kids, it's almost like magic, because you must be, there's never a sense that there's a kid ever, as kids will be curious at that age, you never get a sense that the kid is ever like looking down or being confused or being, the kid is always interacting with Grover or whoever's talking to them. That's something that's a real proper magic trick that almost should spoil it, and you'd almost sort of fear for the kid who's going to go away going, oh no, I hope their experience of it isn't that these things aren't real. You get the impression that these kids take away is that they're absolutely real.
I remember reading what they say to them when the kids say, why is that man got his hand up, Grover? Why is he standing underneath Grover? That kind of thing. They say, oh, well, he's helping him. They're helping him, and that's enough for a lot of kids. And, having young kids, that kind of thing can be because they want to believe, you know what I mean? So you just give them the thing and they're like, okay, but also even works on us. Like when you're watching I was watching some clips of Jim Henson on and Frank Oz on chat shows, right? Talking to hosts, and they'd get the puppet out from behind the sofa and do a bit as Kermit or as Cookie Monster or something, and they would be, as soon as they start doing it, you stop looking at the performer and you just look at the character, because they're so good at it and they put all the life into that and they drain all the life out of themselves. So they're sitting back and kind of, reacting to what the puppet says, but they're very kind of modest looking, like they don't draw the eye at all. And then the puppet has all this expressive stuff. And that's the magic, is like, don't look at me, look at the puppet. And then when they interact with them, they have to switch it. So when they start saying stuff back to the puppet, they'll suddenly become animated and the puppet will go still or just look at the camera or something, but it's absolute genius, the work they're doing. And Grover has the same thing as Kermit in that he has the spindly long arms, so he can do these crazy things that, his arms are rod operated, so they can do quite a lot, but they don't really work like arms. They're kind of like ribbons with hands at the ends. The hands, you basically controlling the hands, but the arms just wiggle around, flap about, right?
Yeah.
Whereas other characters have got a hand in one of their arms, and can do more with that. And that just gives Grover, it's just the little magic things that they do, like his head can open most of the way up, like Pac-Man or whatever, and he'd be so expressive of that, and always look up at the ceiling and open his jaw massively, and he's like despairing. And I love Grover. Just love Grover. Love him. He's the guy you want to be. He's a good person.
Yeah, no, I can see that totally. I think that one of the other clever things is, I remember when the more as a kid you were kind of watching this stuff and seeing the rods, it was more that you'd have to be like, actually, how have they done that? And it was only at that point, it's only at the point that you're trying to figure out how the puppetry is taking place that you notice that there are rods.
Yeah, but
do you know what I mean? It's that sort of, that thing you go, oh, that's how they do it, and it's right in front of me.
But they're so good at it that a lot of the time the rods aren't in shot anyway, because the hands will be like just at the bottom of the camera, so the bottom of the hand where the rod is never there. It's like Big Bird has one arm has Carol Spinney's arm in it, right, and the hand, and the other arm is like a dead arm, and there's a fishing wire, fishing line joining the two of them together via the head. So when this arm goes up, the other arm goes down, and you don't see that fishing line hardly ever. So it's like real magic, because the other real hand is up inside Big Bird's head, operating the eyes and everything.
Of course.
Like that stuff they're just masters, and they're so good at it,
My number 2 is, again, sort of a bit of a cheat, but you'll probably appreciate why. It's Yoda, the Frank Oz operated Yoda. And again, sort of proven, I wanted to have something Frank Oz in it. And kind of for the same reasons. I think Frank Oz is one of those people who's such a kind of talent. And I think of someone who does that, sort of does everything, and is this kind of avuncular figure in the culture who is always kind of behind all these things, and became a film director in the 80s and sort of this comic director, and is this sort of comedian and puppeteer, but also being good at them all. It's not like someone who just tries to do a bit of everything. And I really wanted some sort of Frank Oz representation in my list. And I wanted to do Yoda just because it's something which is, there's so much life in that Yoda puppet, which again, it's doing it, but in that kind of fantasy world, and again, tricking the eye. And it's never really done better in Star Wars or in any of the other things Lucas did with later. The sort of things like, even things like the Dark Crystal, they do it by having all the characters are puppets. And there's bits of Yoda which are done to trick the eye, sometimes with Deep Roy, of course, doing little bits of running and things. But there's a lot of, it's mainly just this bit of puppetry. And one of the things that when they made Yoda CGI, it was one of those things people kind of didn't like it. But still, there's an element of puppetry within that CGI. There isn't. There's
also,
it's still Frank Oz.
Also, it's literally still Frank Oz on set.
Yeah.
For Phantom Menace, it was all done with the puppet, and then they replaced it afterwards with the CGI, and which wasn't the case in the following two prequels. They didn't. Yeah. They didn't even have him
there. And you are losing something, and it is sort of why, you know, they kind of bring him back now, or when they're doing things in like the Mandalorian, to have the kind of what they call the baby Yoda, is that thing where it's sort of important that it's a puppet. Everything is done with puppets again, because you know you're losing something. But I think the kind of performance of that character in I mean, of course, the Star Wars world isn't realistic. It's going to have lots of little monsters or creatures or that aren't human looking, but it is probably the most successful idea that you totally buy into. And of course you go, oh, it's a puppet. Of course you do. If you of course you can intellectualize it and know exactly what it is, but it doesn't mean that it's not real within the scenes.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that when he's acting against Mark Hamill that it doesn't feel like a real performance. And it's probably, you know, you're probably going to have to give Mark Hamill some props for that as well, because it's, you know, all those scenes are really good, and it's funny, and it's a funny character who then you have to take seriously. So it becomes this sort of performance where it's someone doing something comic and then doing something serious. It's like it's proper. It's acting with a puppet.
I just want to say my number 2 is also Yoda, in my effort to have it all Frank Oz. Frank Oz and Catherine Mullen, who does the spare hand of Yoda, and I think does all his facial stuff, his eyes and all that, because there's a lot of moving parts in his face. And also Yoda was designed by a guy called Stuart Freeborn at Lucasfilm. Not Jim Henson. A lot of people think it's Jim Henson. It's not, you know. But yeah, like Yoda, the thing with Yoda of being like vocally, it's pretty similar to Grover, kind of similar to Fozzie Bear, you know, like but it's so funny. Like it has a big range, and that it's the weirdest thing that in Empire Strikes Back, every Star Wars film has the kind of light relief silly characters, right? And they have the serious sort of gravitas serious characters, right? In Empire Strikes Back, Yoda is both of them. You know, Yoda is the like silly, like knocking things over and all that stuff, you know, like throwing all the stuff out of his bag. He's the silly character. He's the Jar Jar Binks, and he's also the Alec Guinness. You know what I mean? He's also the Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's both of those things, and he switches like that. You know, there's scenes where he's all laughing, and then he's like, you know, and goes, you know, I can't teach him that stuff. But he switches like that. And yeah, Mark Hamill has to switch with it. They're just incredible scenes. Like the idea that it's like a small latexy puppet that's doing all this stuff. And it could be a lot of people's favorite character in the whole series. Like he's well up there for me, you know?
Yeah.
It's proper magic.
And he also remains, for the people that take Star Wars very seriously, they wouldn't see that character as being silly at all.
Right. So the guys, they might hate Ewoks, or they might hate Jar Jar Binks or whatever, you know, or they might be like me and kind of hate C-3PO, you know, like, you know, I like how he looks, but and he fits but yeah, Yoda, I never hear anyone slating off Yoda, but that's a puppet. It's a puppet with silly gags, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, but it's the best.
It's a really good performance. And again, it's that. And I think partly, if it wasn't Frank Oz, I mean, I'm sure they would have always found a very talented puppeteer and they would have needed that.
Well, they asked for
And
Jim
that's
Henson.
exactly right.
George Lucas asked Jim Henson, and Jim Henson was like, I'm running this company. I got films I'm making. I can't do it. Have Frank.
Right. Okay. Because that's it. I mean, if it was in the hands of a lesser talent,
Or even an
it
equal
just
talent.
wouldn't
If it was
work.
Jim Henson, it would be a much softer, more ethereal. You could see what you could imagine what kind of Yoda that would be, right? A Jim Henson Yoda. But it wouldn't have that kind of comic to serious range in the same way. I mean, maybe it would be so different, you know, that gruffness, that wildness that Frank Oz brings with his voicing, where it's like, you know, like, "Ugh!" That's, you know, he's just absolute magic. Absolute magic. And yeah, like the funny thing is when they replace him with CGI, because you still have Frank Oz doing the voice, your brain does the same stuff. It goes, doesn't look like him, doesn't look right, doesn't look quite right, you know, but it's still got the right voice, right? So your brain kind of, you know, blends over it. And then he came back in for the 2017. I didn't know that was going to be in the film, so now I was like, wow, spoilers. But I was, you know, I just love to see that puppet. And you know what? Well, we should talk about this now because Star Wars does have some other puppets in it. Like Jabba the Hutt is a very complicated puppet, but like you were saying,
Yeah.
Jabba doesn't convey any of the kind of range, emotions, and stuff that Yoda does at all. Doesn't
No.
He just looks like a big, sort of solid lump with a moving lip and a moving tongue and some eyes. Like it, where you know he's huge, but he still doesn't convey any of the same thing. And then most of the other characters are kind of
The other puppets don't really have to put in a performance. That's what it's doing. It's not. You can have things. You can have salacious Crumb
right.
laughing.
He just
and
laughs
being
and
like
points. He feels very Muppety. He feels very. He could be in Dark Crystal. He could be in, you know, something else. But no, Yoda's like a performance that has to.
Yeah, and again, a character who believably breathes, I always think is like feels living and breathing.
What could be better than Yoda? What's your number one?
Well, rather inevitably, I would think my number one is your number five. So my number one is Kermit the Frog, which I almost use to represent all of Jim Henson, essentially, as being the kind of avatar for that. And I think it's more that there's something upsetting about the Muppets not being real. There's something that's deeply unsettling about the idea of it. And I don't particularly like talking about it now. I find it quite I read Bruce Forsyth's autobiography about 10 or 15 years ago, because of course I did.
Of course.
And there's a bit where he's talking about being on the Muppet Show and talking about leaving and seeing all the Muppets hanging up and how eerie it was. And even reading that, it makes you go, ugh, that's horrible. Because they're sort of quite believable. It sounds childish in a way, but there's something that you kind of like we're talking about with those kids talking to Grover. It's that you can kind of imbue so much life into them. And also, I think the main thing, like I consider myself a Muppet fan, but I am far from being like, there's a lot of Muppet stuff that I don't like. And I feel now there's an element to lots of people who are Muppet fans almost see it as a bit like, you know, it's people don't like you being a bit negative about some of the stuff, but I find some of it that it's almost like I want better from it. Some of it is brilliant, and there's bits of it where you're a bit like, that's not really good enough, that's not good enough. And I think the big turning point, I think, for me was that Muppets Remember Jim Henson thing after Jim Henson died, which I think is just such a kind of incredibly moving TV show, which is all done with puppets. And I defy anyone not to be in tears by the end of it, because it's such a real thing, and it's about puppets dealing with grief and also trying to explain what death is to children. And this, it's sort of quite a, I don't know, it's a incredibly kind of like brilliant bit. Like, it's, for me, when people, like, for me, I'm not a big fan of Muppets Christmas Carol. I think it's all right. I think it's all right. I think it's mid-level Muppets.
You're gonna get some hate.
You're
gonna get some hate mail for that.
But like, I don't dislike it. I think it's like middling. Yet the Muppets, the great achievement of the Muppets is the Muppets Remember Jim Henson.
Yeah.
That is I think that's the height of it. And I think they're in, like, I really like the Muppet Show, and I really like, because I like that sort of musical vaudeville thing with those characters. Really appeals to my sensibilities. I really like seeing a thing, especially made in that era with those kind of guest stars. It appeals to me. It appeals to things I like. I like the Muppet Show a lot. But like you say, I think one of the best things about Jim Henson is Sesame Street. I think Sesame Street is also this sort of, is a genuinely magical show, which is better than all the other, like, it's probably the best thing that they've done. It's probably better than the Muppet Show. It's got much more, it's just as funny, and it's more magic because of that kind of interaction with kids, and because it's sort of believable. The Muppet Show is a really good comedy show.
Yeah.
And Sesame Street is something else. It's better than that. It's beyond its own genre or something. It's really like an important show, and it's also like it's an elevated show. It's a sort of pretty incredible piece of work. And I'd put something like, I think the Muppets Remember Jim Henson is kind of where they mix those things,
Right,
and sort of create something which is genuinely like a sort of incredible piece of television.
and the effect,
And it's sort of,
there was the effect it had on the people that our age or a bit older or a bit younger that watched it. And the thing about Jim Henson dying is it affected so many people, and it shows you how much it affected the people who worked with him, but also all the fans. It's mad that he died at that time. You know, one of the most, we were just talking about Frank Oz. It's amazing, you know, playing Yoda in 2017, and, you know, playing him in 1980, or playing Cookie Monster, or, you know, Grover or whoever for, you know, 30 years. That's incredible. And the idea that we didn't have that with Jim Henson, and he went at that moment, you know, it was just hard to deal with. And they in that program, they really tackled the problem of how do we go on, how do we communicate this to our fans, to the kids at home and stuff. It's astonishing. And, you know, they'd already done it on Sesame Street as well, because they had Mr. Hooper dying, you know, and they deal with that. It's not as moving, but that attitude of like, well, death happens, we're going to incorporate that into our thing.
yeah.
And I think about things now. I think about how many kids there are around the world who are crazy Black Panther fans, you know, and having had
Chadwick Boseman.
Yeah, Chadwick Boseman dying last year. They're going to keep using the character or something. They're not sure. They haven't said, but I don't think they're not going to be saying, "Hey, kids at home, this guy's died, and it's not the character, it's the actor, but we need to deal with, you know, and he was important, and this is how." To be able to communicate that to your audience, that stuff, and take that responsibility for it. It's the kind of Sesame Street like responsibility, but with the kind of, it's more affecting because it's the kind of funny, fun guy characters of the Muppet Show.
Yeah. I think that's the height of it, and it's almost like the height of culture. It's like it's such a huge achievement, I think, and I think that's why I'd have it as mine. I mean, it's a bit of a cheat because I've basically incorporated the entire Henson company into my number one choice.
But you probably did what I did, which is go through all the Muppets and be like, "There's all these great Muppets, you know, yeah, Fozzie Bear's great, Ralph's great, you know, Rolf's great, you know, I like Beaker, I even like, you know, what's the guy, Pepe the King
yeah,
Prawn.
like
That's the
prawn.
last great one, right? That was like the 90s one. Brilliant. You know, there's so many little characters. You know, some people crazy about the Swedish chef or whatever, or you know, like there's so many great characters, but it seems totally like churlish to be like pick anyone other than Kermit, because
Mm.
he just sums up the whole thing, and he he
He
represents
does.
himself as well.
Yeah, and he's the sort of in fact, he isn't always a great guy. He's a human being.
Yeah.
He's got that like but a good person, but he's not like the best. He's not perfect by any means.
I bet you were just talking about kind of being the thing of being bigger culturally, being this huge cultural thing. You know what Jim Henson does and everything, and with the sort of two twin things of the Muppet Show and Sesame Street. But to me, it ranks with the absolute titans of American kids culture of the mostly second half of the 20th century. You know, your Charles Schultz and your Carl Sandburgs and your I don't know, something like Mr. Rogers doesn't transfer to this country in the same way, but those absolutely huge Dr. Zeus, you know, like that would be me. It'd be like Schultz, Dr. Zeus, Jim Henson,
Maurice Sendak,
Maurice
kind of.
Sendak, yeah. But I love Maurice Sendak, but you know, the number of his books that are phenomenal isn't that great in my opinion, because he changes his art style so much and stuff. But yeah, no, he's brilliant. But it's that same. It's this sort of like PBS worthy for the people, educational, wholesome, but witty, like really smart, intelligent people making it that covers all those things. It's an incredible feeling that comes up in that kind of 50s, 60s America for kids.
And I should ask, what is your number one?
My number one is a bit of a change. It's a Frank Oz character. It's not a change at all. It's a puppet whose name is Sydney, or Sid. That's his real name, but he's better known as the Cookie Monster. And like I said, I would have had Grover as number one a few years ago, and maybe I would have had Yoda as number one when I was a young man, you know. But I watch Sesame Street with my kids, and I play Sesame Street records with my kids, and Cookie Monster's just irrepressible childlikeness, and I mean childlike as when people say like innocent and lovely and all that, like impulsive, completely lacking in sense, just wants what they want, eats everything. Like that's what having little kids is like having a bunch of Cookie Monsters around, right? And I love him. It's just the most like exuberant performance. The puppet is amazing. There's a thing now. This is the thing where Frank Oz. It's another Frank Oz one, right? There's the voice and the puppetry, right? And he is one where there's one hand inside the face doing the mouth. The eyes are just googly eyes. So when you wiggle, the eyes wiggle around, right? And the other hand is in the left hand, the left hand of Cookie Monster, and his right hand is generally just pinned to his chest, or if they want the right hand for something, somebody else has to operate that, right? And the guy who does the voice now, what's he called? He's David Rudman. He's cool. He does the voice really good, right? But he can't do the puppeteering as well, because there's a thing with Cookie Monster that Frank Oz does where the hand, you know, his hands are kind of feathery, and they have kind of feathery fluff coming off, because it's a fluffy monster. They have fluffy bit coming off the end, almost like nails. And he does this kind of like flappy hand thing, and he drums his fingers on the desk, and he kind of combs his beard as if he's, you know, finding crumbs and stuff. And when he eats it, the hand, what he does with his hand, not the hand inside the puppet face, but the free hand, is magic. Like he puts so much personality into that hand. It's like the hand itself should get some kind of Oscar or something, you know. Like both hands of Frank Oz are master actors, you know. And it's Cookie Monster, phenomenal. He's got the best songs, you know. C is for Cookies, obviously famous one, but my favorite song of his on the Sears Cookie album, which is sitting behind me, is a duet with another great character, is Count Von Count, voiced by Jerry Nelson, so he's not one of the big two, and he does a version of "If I Knew You Were Coming, I'd Have Baked a Cake." And Cookie Monster's like, if me knew you were coming, me to bake the cake. 1 cake, bake the cake. 2 cakes, bake the cake. 3 cakes. And it's just and he's like, how'd you do? How'd you do? How'd you do? 3, how'd you do's? It's the best stuff. And you imagine these guys are, big shout out to Joe Raposo, who wrote all the Sesame Street songs and stuff. But these guys were going into the studio and recording their puppet characters. And I want to know, they must have taken the puppet in, right? There's no way they just recorded them in a vocal booth with a microphone.
I think you kind of need it as well. Like, you probably need it to get into the right voice and things.
Totally. I can't.
I'm not sure you could do it.
I want to see like
by yourself,
a montage video, like the We Are the World video, but with the Sesame Street characters in the studio with headphones on, like recording their parts. No, I don't know what to say about Cookie Monster. He's still great. He's still on Sesame Street. He's on the Furchester Hotel that the BBC make. That's a spin-off. My kids love him. I love him. To me, he's the most Frank Oz of all the Frank Oz. He doesn't have the range of Yoda. You know, he's not as tender and emotionally meaningful as Grover or Bert or something, you know, with those emotional moments. He's pretty basic, but he's just like to me the most magic, even more so than Yoda. It's like I look at Cookie Monster and I'm like, that's a guy I know. I love that guy. He's got the most charisma in the world. I love that guy, and he has a character, you know, like he's a person.
Sure. And not to diminish what you've just said, but it's also great when he puts cookies in his mouth and they crumble up.
It's great when he puts cookies in his mouth. And you know, they can't use real cookies, so they have to bake these kind of like crazy cookies with funny recipes with hot glue as the chips, so they don't damage the mouth and stuff. I've read a thing which was like for Furchester Hotel now they bake 200 or 600 of these huge cookies a week just for filming. Mad.
You know what though, on something like that they'd have to struggle to get them away from the kids. I don't think I'd be able to see those 600 cookies without being kind of a bit trying to grab one or just trying to have a pinch of one of these cookies that Cookie Monster would otherwise scoff.
Do you remember when you used to go to the NFT bar on the Thames on the waterfront, and they sold those giant cookies?
Yes.
And you, as a kid, you could see them through the window, and you'd want one because they looked like Cookie Monster cookies. They were so big. They never tasted that good, but you really wanted them because there was the only place I remember seeing cookies that big. Oh, big, you know, Cookie Monster mouth-sized cookies. I don't know. I just like, and I watched all the clips of, because the character had been around, like evolving through the 60s. They had this green monster with sharp teeth in an advert that Jim Henson was doing, and then, you know, then he was in some other IBM like internal training video joke thing where he's like, there's a coffee machine and it blows up and he tries to eat bits of it and stuff, and it's not quite Cookie Monster. And then when they start Sesame Street, they're like, well, we just use this monster that will take the sharp teeth out and we'll make him blue, and you know, and then then he hands it over to Frank Oz, and that's where the magic happens. It's like the collaboration between Henson and Frank Oz is the magic of all these things. So I have picked the most unvaried list, but I went through everything and was just like, no, I can't get any of these other guys into my list. I can't take any of these out.
You've got a top 5 Frank Oz.
I got Henson does 1.5 and Frank Oz does 3.5.
Okay. All
but
right.
Basically, I just couldn't. I mean, the other ones that I was trying to get in, you mentioned like Gordon the Gopher or something. You know, the first other one for me, early one, was the Crow. Do you remember the Scouse Crow from Saturday Superstore?
Yeah,
it was kind of rubbish, but that was the first one. I think that was the first one where it was like interacting with people, because Button Moon was its own show, its own world, right? We're talking about this thing where they have to interact with people, and you've got this stupid crow with a Scouse accent, really rough Scouse accents, talking to Mike Reed or Sarah Green or something.
Sarah Green.
And that was, but he's rubbish as well. I mean, but then Gordon the Gopher, just not expressive enough and just, squeaky and stuff. It's not that great. If you watch Gordon the Gopher back, it just makes you appreciate Philip Schofield more, because he's the one who's making that work. He's great.
Yeah, I think a lot of them don't really have a lot of personality. I mean, honourable mention to someone like a Zig and Zag or something, who are genuinely funny. I like Cosmo and Dibs, although that's very much a BBC trying to do Sesame Street show.
Yeah, Cosmo and Dibs are weird because they're always looking down. They're like looking down at they never look up. There must have been something about the puppet where they couldn't do it, and they're just constantly looking down at the floor. Very weird. Like they just couldn't quite get there. I had some ones from films, like the Rock Biter from Neverending Story. That's a puppet.
Yeah, it's a nice
but it's kind of a stationary puppet. Ludo from Labyrinth. There's a lot in Labyrinth, but that's the one I like best. And that's the only one that I thought of that is a person inside puppet, like Big Bird, a person inside with a hand up to do the face and a hand outside. Like, I like him. The one I was trying to squeeze into my top 5 was George from Rainbow. As his Wikipedia says very, very clearly, he is an effeminate anthropomorphic pink hippo, which is amazing thing to be in the 70s. I'm still fond of George. I still think George is funny.
Sure. Rather than the more showboaty Zippy.
Zippy's voice is annoying. But the same guy did the voice for both of them at the same time. Like, so he was operating one of them but doing both their voices.
He's someone whose name I would know at some point in the past.
Roy Skelton.
Roy Skelton.
Yeah,
that's right.
Roy Skelton. And the weird thing, Rainbow is awful. Rainbow is awful, but I really have I want to say a soft spot for George. But I think George is like suitably bizarre and funny, and Zippy's like not in the same way. But like, it's such a weird show if you go and watch some of that. Why does Bungle have a normal voice? Like, the other two have like funny voices, and Bungle's just like, "Oh, I say, George, what's going on? I've had enough." Like, why? He's like a big ugly bear. Why does he have a sort of normal voice? Doesn't make any sense. Show is terrible. And those clips of them like doing the like joke innuendo-y episode for ITV and Eternal Christmas Party or whatever it was. And also they went on like there's a clip of them with like Jim Davidson. There's a clip of them with Jim Davidson like on a game showy thing where they're all swearing and stuff, and it really puts you off them. It's like, ugh.
I don't like any of that. Where Keith Harrison Orville and doing a blue version of their act. No. It's like, just don't do it. Retire.
Yeah, I'm not into
retire. Don't do a kids thing.
Not into that.
I really hate all that stuff.
I tell you what one I do like, Lamb Chop.
Oh yeah.
Sherman Lewis Lamb Chop. That's really funny. Like, you'd only see that on like sort of throwback programs, like clip shows. It'd be like, this was the good stuff back in the day, because but she was great. And that's just a sock.
My family had always visit a restaurant at Christmas and things in Soho. There was an Italian family restaurant called Topazio that was named after the puppet mouse. And I always quite liked that in the restaurant they would have like wooden statues of this mouse puppet. But I wasn't really familiar with the puppet because it was before my time. But now I have since looked up Topazio, who is a puppet mouse with a comic, exaggerated Italian accent. But the act is great. It's a marionette, and it's a real impressive act. It's like, well done. And you see it at places like I've seen it done on Sunday night at London Palladium and things. And you go, it must be tiny for the audience, but it is a really impressive.
Yeah, that's like
the Topazio act.
That's like watching the Lamb Chop at the London Palladium or something. It's literally a sock on this woman's arm on a huge stage. Like there's no. It's not like now where you'd have a big TV screen showing you the close up. They're just kind of going, I guess there's something there on her arm. I want to. We were talking about the little angel at the start, but the Little Angel did a production of Angelo, book 70s book by Quentin Blake, which was one of my favorite books as a kid. And I saw their show as a kid in the 80s. And they just, when they finished a show, they, you know, it tours or whatever, and then they stick it all in the cupboard, and they bring it back out again. And so I got to take my kids to see the same Angelo show at the same Little Angel Theatre that I saw 30 years earlier or whatever. You know, then that was quite
nice.
something. That was quite something. Our puppets are fantastic. I don't know, just love them.
I should say as well that today's episode of List Off has been brought to you not by the Children's Television Workshop, but by a couple of our viewers or listeners, and they are Dave Russell and Graham Murphy, who came up and suggested but not Muppets. We basically have done Muppets. Suggested puppets for for us this week, and that's just a reminder as well that if you've got any lists that you would like us to do a top 5 of, to make your suggestions known to us in either the comments, or if you're writing an iTunes review, or you can find us on Twitter and Instagram on ListOffPod, and you can make your suggestions of anything that you would like us to do a top 5 of, and very slowly we will get through as many of these as we can.
Yeah, I mean, this one is very up our street, so it was like, let's do that one.
Yeah, we'll do this. We'll do some puppets.
I'm going to put some links up in the show notes, but also on worldofproper.com/listoff with just some of the great clips that I was looking at this week leading up to this. Like, you've got to see the Sesame Street Tiny Desk concert. That's quite touching. And the camera test from the Muppet movie. Have you ever seen that?
No, I don't think so.
It's Kermit and Rolf behind a tree, like in, I guess, like Jim Henson's garden or something, and they're just improvising, talking rubbish, just so they can, I don't know, they're just, you know, they're just filming it on a low quality camera or something, you know. And it's just great. Like, there's something so funny about puppet outtakes when they stay in character, like the Emmett Otter's Jug Band outtakes from the Jim Henson film, like all that stuff. They stay in character, and they'll be like looking at the things happening, and, you know, looking at the camera. Oh, and this is something I wanted to say when you were talking about like the Jim Henson dying show and all that. That there's a quote I read from Steve Whitmire, who took over, who was already working with Henson and took over. He kind of said, you need to take over Kermit, and they sent him the Kermit puppet so he could start practicing. And he said he got the puppet out and sat in front of the mirror, and he put it on, and he had, you know, he looked back at himself with Kermit, and he just broke down, couldn't say anything, put it away. He said he put it away in his cupboard for a month. He couldn't do it, you know. And he said it smelt like Jim. The puppet smelt like Jim, you know. That really got to me. And
well, that's that. I mean, the whole thing of that Muppets Remember Jim Henson is the ending, because of course throughout the episode Kermit is missing, and it's a horrible thing to watch because you assume it's based on the idea that, well, Kermit's gone because there's no Jim Henson anymore, and it's Kermit turning up at the end with a new voice is the thing which is like the kind of, oh, it's gonna go on, it's still gonna go on, it's that kind of, Kermit's not dead, it's still carrying on. Beautiful piece of TV.
Yep. We'd have a crying ending of the show.
Sad ending.
We'll see you next time. Thanks very much. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.